You're listening to the Vint Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast presented by Corvin. Corvin is the world leader in at-home wine preservation, allowing you to pour a glass of your favorite wine and enjoy more bottles in your cellar without having to pop the cork. And listeners should know that from now until next episode launch, we'll be giving away a Corvin Timeless device to one listener who emails us at brady@vint.co. It's BRADY @VINT.co. with a quick note, quick hello, and suggestion on who you would like to see featured on the next Vint Podcast episode. So again, email us with an interview suggestion, producers that you like, or anyone else in the industry at Brady@Vint.co, and you may be selected to get a brand new Corvin in your hands. As always, I'm joined by my co-host, Billy Galanko, who is gearing up for a big weekend.
Yeah, pretty exciting. But before that, I had pretty good 4th of July. How was yours, Brady?
Slow, and I bought an Italian bottle of Italian wine that looks like it comes in one of those. It's called Voss. You know that, like, Voss water.
Mm-hmm.
It's a wine, I guess, from the same producer manufacturer, and it's in like a Voss bottle essentially, and it's a still Prosecco. And I walked into a liquor store near my parents' place, and they were like tabling, and so I tried it. Actually, it wasn't terrible. It's like, I don't know, $14, and I thought the bottle was interesting, so I bought it and brought it to my parents, and that's the kind of thing they would like, and it was actually not bad. So that was my little find this weekend.
Nice. Was it 100% Glera, or
what was the grape variety? I don't know the variety. It was something I wasn't super familiar with. No, it wasn't that though.
Because that's the primary grape that they make Prosecco with.
Voss still Prosecco. Oh, sorry, I said Voss. It says Voga, but I think it's the same like brand. I'm pretty sure it has to be. It's like the.
This is some great podcast.
Oh no, it is Glera. You're right. Yep. So that was interesting, and it was good though.
Nice. I had I guess we went up to Big Bear, which is a kind of a local mountain up here in Southern California. It was extremely hot. Watched some fireworks, and they have like no wine up there at all. We tried going to the place with the best wine list in town, and it was mediocre at best. We went to a wine bar, and it was just a bunch of private labeled things. So anyway, don't go to Big Bear for wine. It's a pretty area if you want to go hike. But I came home though, and we had a skin contact. I had a skin contact Glera as well. It was Glera and like a secondary grape that is growing up in that area that I've never really heard of. Apparently, it's just kind of typically a blending grape, but that was cool. And then we also had a skin contact Vernaccia, which is like the Tuscan, like the most well-known Tuscan white that's like bottled on its own. So it was kind of cool. Both of them one was 2020 and one was 2021. And it was kind of cool to see grapes that you don't typically see in a skin contact style. And not only was it skin contact, but they both had a little bit of age on it. And it was really cool. Vernaccia, I don't know how much Vernaccia you've had before, but what I like about it is it tends to have more of like a textured palate. It's a little bit more savory, not necessarily fruit forward, but it has a very textured palate and some solid minerality depending on the producer and where it's from. So that was a cool juxtaposition next to like Glera and this other grape that are typically, like fruity Prosecco style. It still had a little bit of the fruitiness, but it was mellowed over time. And it was really interesting kind of getting the expression of the skin in a different kind of more savory almost way, but like kind of like a more extracted. So it was neat.
It makes me think of like, do they make any skin contact whites out of like Viognier and in the Rhone?
I'm sure they do. I haven't really had any. Aromatic varieties, whether it be Muscat, Riesling, I'm sure Viognier too, tend to be very good for skin contact because you can extract I mean, I've had good skin contact Vermentino. I wouldn't necessarily put that up as super aromatic, but it extracts a lot of those compounds. I will say that typically you can get a lot of phenolic bitterness in some Vignes. So you would have to be, the winemaker would just have to be conscious about how much they're extracting in terms of like texture and tannin, as well as the flavor. But I'm sure those are very good. I think I'm sure I've had one in California, but they make literally every style out of everything here. So,
yeah, very cool. Yeah. Well, we're drinking the Italian varieties, I guess.
So I think our intro was kind of a perfect segue into our interview with Ray, because just kind of like with Eric Asimov, he's constantly looking at food or wine from a food and wine kind of lens, kind of pairing, trying to find the best combinations of flavor. And I think just like Eric Asimov, he's exploring outside of a lot of these traditional styles and traditional wines and constantly looking for new things. So I think the conversation was really interesting to me, that he was, up kind of a little bit on the quote unquote natural wine movement. He was up on some skin contact styles, but yet also, very well educated and, well versed in the traditional styles as well. So I thought that was really cool about the interview.
Yeah. And his book that we discuss a bit in the interview, The World in a Wine Glass, is, he talks about artisanal varieties, and you mentioned sort of, traditional. And I think we had a bit of a conversation about, when someone thinks of a particular region, sort of the mainstream, quote unquote, traditional varieties come to mind, but there's like a capital T traditional wine culture often underneath of that, right? Whereby you have, indigenous varieties and, table wines that are unique to that region. And, he's still trying to put forward a book with suggestions on producers and wines that are accessible, but I think he wanted to go a layer deeper. And so, the focus on artisanal and local and traditional, like I said, with a capital T, is, one of the focuses of a lot of Ray's work. So it was great hearing from him, and someone who's been writing in mainstream sort of wine journalism for so long, who has that ability to, speak really directly to nuance, but also in an accessible way. He's a great educator.
Agreed. Yeah, and I actually got that book after our interview, so I've listened to most of it on Audible. And what's really nice is he has like sections on sustainability, organic viticulture, biodynamics, regenerative agriculture, and just the section about natural wine, like literally titled that. So it's kind of nice. So he like kind of takes these terms that you may hear flung about that are kind of coming more into the zeitgeist of wine, and he really takes in, describes them and breaks them down in like a really digestible manner. So I think I recommend everybody check out his book as well, if you want just like a little bit more. And then he also has a ton of great producer recommendations in there, and which is nice because it's not just the big names that you would know from everywhere. He has, of course, some of those, but he tried to stay away and really give his inside tips on people that he's met and tasted with for years.
Yeah. Yeah, so today's interview is with Ray Isle. He is the editor-in-chief, or the lead editor for wine at Food and Wine Magazine. And his book, The World in a Wine Glass, is a great resource if you're looking to explore more producers in more regions and some wines that are maybe a little bit off the beaten path in those cultures. So enjoy this interview with Ray. But before we get to the interview, we do have a word from Corvin, our sponsor. And just remember, if you're looking to drink more wine from your cellar without worrying about wasting what you can't consume, one of the Corvin systems will be your best friend, no doubt. You can visit corvin.com and use code VINT15 for 15% off your purchase on one of their devices. And if you're a member of the trade, you can visit trade.corvin.com for exclusive discounts on their whole range of products and accessories for work and home. And here is Ray Isle. Hey, Ray, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm psyched to be here.
This is awesome. Food and wine editor. Tell me about how you got into that gig. You've been there a while.
Yeah, I've been at Food and Wine since 2005, which in magazine years is like a million years because people don't stay that long at magazines. But I've been very fortunate that Food and Wine's been relatively stable and successful, and also that it's been just a lot of good people to work with. So I haven't ever wanted to leave. I got to Food and Wine from Wine and Spirits magazine, where I worked before Food and Wine, which was the now late lamented Wine and Spirits, because it's hanging up after this issue. And then prior to that, I worked for a while. For a couple of years, I was a supplier rep selling port in New York, work with distributors. And then prior to that, I was in academia. I was a grad student in literature and creative writing, and that was kind of I fell in love with wine while I was still in the university, grad student world, and eventually decided I'd better make a career of it, because otherwise I was going to bankrupt myself.
Yeah, you need a way to drink wine, at the media tastings that they do, so you didn't have to buy all of that stuff.
Absolutely, yeah, and unfortunately, a grad student salary does not get you very much in the way of wine.
Yeah.
So
yeah. What kind of writing were you doing before?
So I was primarily writing fiction. I was writing short stories, and I published some short stories in literary quarterlies and so on. I thought I was going down a university professor path, which was not not entirely surprising, since my father was a professor of English at Rice University, and so I kind of, in that classic way, got out of college with an English degree, didn't know what the hell I was supposed to do, messed around for a while, moved to Austin, did what people do in Austin after college, which is not much other than hang out, drink beer. And then I went to did a master's at Boston University, and did a thing called a Stegner Fellowship at Stanford, and then taught for a few years at Stanford. But during that kind of period where I was at BU and then Stanford, I started getting interested in wine, partly because of a former girlfriend who worked at as grad students often do. She was a server at a high-end restaurant, and so she learned something about wine. And I didn't have a lot of, I didn't grow up with it. I didn't have any knowledge to start with beyond I could tell red from white, and that was about it. And that, and probably bubbles from from red and white. And that was the sum of my knowledge. But I started getting interested in it, and then, did the usual things that one does. I bought the Hugh Johnson Pocket Guide. I started trying to spend whatever, tiny amount of free cash I had on interesting bottles, and the interest kind of grew and grew. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today if I hadn't gotten a writing fellowship in the Bay Area at Stanford, because that put me close to wineries. So I started hanging out, going to wine. I mean, the things you do, you go to Napa, taste wine, go to Sonoma, taste wine. Then I started helping out bottlings, because they would pay you in wine. And then I switched my teaching schedule around where I could work harvest. And I was a volunteer cellar rat for a couple of harvests, like hauling barrels and endlessly cleaning all sorts of things. And if I'd gotten a fellowship at Michigan or Iowa or anywhere else instead, there's no chance I would have followed the same path in terms of wine. So it's very sort of fortunate or serendipitous or random or whatever term you want to use for it.
Would you say that being able to get your hands dirty in that aspect kind of early on in your wine journey helped influence your appreciation for what goes into making a wine taste the way it does, whether it be place or process or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Hugely so, I would say. I mean, though I didn't know it. I mean, when I was doing, when I was sort of helping out with bottlings and then working harvest particularly, one thing you learn during that harvest process is just the transformation that happens to grapes as they turn into wine. And you learn it not just on a sort of intellectual level, you learn it through what it smells like and what it looks like and how things taste as they change. And I mean, honestly, every single person who wants to write about wine should probably do that for a couple of harvests, because it really teaches you the way wine becomes wine in a very visceral, sensory way. And I didn't know at the time I was going to write about wine. I thought, I kind of got into doing that thinking, well, it's interesting. Maybe I'll write like something like a story for the Stanford Alumni Magazine or something, and call it quits after that, but be something fun to do. So it wasn't like I was literally preparing myself, but the other thing it did was also kind of teach me that I didn't really want to be in production. It's like I have massive respect for winemakers, but apparently I didn't really want to be one. I felt like I was better at words. And so while I learned a lot, I also kind of learned I didn't really want to haul barrels around and clean macro bins, all the time. Of course, once you're fairly successful winemaker, you stop cleaning bins, but it's a long way till you get there. So it taught me an enormous amount. To this day, you don't forget the way that wine smells when it's fermenting and how it transforms, over just those few weeks. It's a pretty cool thing.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Early on in my wine studies, I didn't really know how so my background, I was in digital advertising and then took some sommelier kind of learning. So I took the first two levels of the exams. After that, I didn't really know how I wanted to get into wine before I quit my advertising job. So then I did quit the job and go work a harvest to see if I wanted to work in production. And I had a very similar experience. I was down in Australia, learned a lot, got to taste wine as it's fermenting and exactly all the things you just said. And then I also decided I do not want to work in a winery, at least right now. But I think it's really interesting. I think there are other writers. I've heard, MWs and also MSs say once you get your hands dirty, you get a different appreciation. Maybe it's not necessarily deeper, but it provides a more well-rounded aspect. And I think, there are critics right now, even like William Kelly, who are developing more of a different sense of wine, even when they start making it as well.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And the other thing, the second side of that is because I went from that. I left academia, but partly because I met my now wife, who was in New York, and she had no real interest in moving to California to be with unemployed potential wine guy. It's a hard sell. She had a job, for instance. But when I basically switched from what I was doing to selling wine, which also was incredibly educational. And I think one of the risks of wine writing sometimes is you forget that the stuff actually has to function in a marketplace. If no one buys it, it doesn't matter how you made it. And just learning the whole structure of distributors and importers and how wines get on the shelves and why some wines get bought and others don't and again, I didn't necessarily know it at the time, but it was incredibly helpful. I'm very glad that I did that. I'm glad I also did it for 2 years and not for the rest of my life, because I'm not that good a salesperson. I'm not sure I have the killer instinct that really great salespeople have, but it was certainly educational. And additionally, to this day, you could airdrop me into anywhere, any borough of New York City, and I can find you a liquor store within 5 minutes, because I've been to practically all of them.
Yeah, there's wine reps, those sales reps are known to be sharks in the industry. So I'm glad you sidestepped that.
Yeah, I'm sociable and I can talk to people, but I'm not a great closer on the deal side.
Sure. Yeah. Thinking about saying that you're good at words and writing was the avenue that you ultimately end up taking into the industry. Did you ever work in or consider, marketing, branding, storytelling, that kind of thing? Because it definitely seems like producers have put a greater emphasis on tightening up their brand story and narrative around, what they're doing in such a way that, you probably were on the front end of that.
Yeah. So I did think about it. I think, Billy, you said earlier, it's a little unclear how you're supposed to get into this wine business thing. It's like there's not a guidebook out there. You sort of fall in love with wine and you're like, okay. And so I was working for Dow's for Premium Port Wines, which is the Symington family, which imports 1,000 grams. And I was selling wine. I knew I wanted to get out of that sales related job, but I wasn't. I was writing on the side, kind of freelance, not just about wine, but really about anything I could write about. And I didn't know quite where to go or how to make that into a career. And so what I did was I actually got offered a job as a marketer for with Clicquot, dealing with, I think the job was for being the brand person for Hein Cognac and Scharfenberger back when Scharfenberger was owned by Clicquot, weirdly enough, and I that's where I was sort of trying to figure out what to do and where to go, and what happened was that Josh Green at Wine and Spirits had read a story I had written, oddly, for the Stanford Alumni magazine about, and not about wine, as a profile of a novelist. And it said in the little bio that Rael works in the wine business in New York, and he got in touch with me about potentially freelancing for him. And that pretty quickly turned into a job about potential editing. And so he offered me a job more or less the Friday before I was supposed to turn up at Clicquot. And I took it, and I never turned up at Clicquot. So I came very close to working in marketing, but I literally sidestepped at the last possible moment. And it was really because what I wanted to do was write and edit, and it happened. And so again, I was very fortunate to be in the right place at the right time. And that Josh happened to read this story of mine it was through a series of random connections. Someone else who worked for him had gone to Stanford and got the alumni magazine and passed it along to him, saying, "Hey, apparently this guy works in wine in New York." And so, yeah, I mean, it's, and the two are related. I mean, storytelling is storytelling. I do think that there are real stories and there are, commercial fake stories. There are plenty of stories out there that don't honestly have that much to do with the reality, that are meant to sell products. So I'm more interested in the ones that are grounded in fact or emotional truth or anything like that. But the skill set applies to both, I guess you could say.
Brady, you want to go ahead?
But yeah, I was just going to ask, from the early days when you started at Food and Wine then till now, how has, and I'm sure, you've kind of taken it your own direction as, the editor. How has the way that the magazine treated and talked about wine and sort of like the culture of wine at the magazine changed since you've been there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the culture of wine has changed a little bit at Food and Wine. It's been pretty consistent. Partly it's been pretty consistent because I've been here so long that, I've been relatively consistent. The magazine is called Food and Wine. So there's obviously a heavy emphasis on wine in the context of the culinary world. So we've covered probably more than some other magazines. We cover a lot of what happens in the sommelier world. We cover a lot of, how wine interacts with food and that kind of thing. I mean, we don't have a large section of wines that we score. That's never been the focus of the magazine. So we're a culinary magazine with a heavy emphasis on wine rather than a wine magazine, I guess is the way to put it. And I think, some things have changed over time. The giant change has been the growth of the online side of the publication. I mean, when I started at Food and Wine, which is, like I said, 2005, it's a long time ago, we had a website, but it was kind of like everybody's figuring out what to do with a website. That was about it.
Probably like an index or a directory.
An index, or just kind of like repeated everything that we, printed in the magazine. And now we produce a tremendous amount of digital content every day. Not all of it. I mean, mostly not wine. A lot of recipes and stuff. But the agenda for digital content is somewhat different from the agenda for print. You've got, it's more SEO, search engine optimization driven. It's more about what draws eyeballs. It's less visual because you're not going to hire a photographer to do an on-site shoot for a digital story. So there's a balancing act of that. And there's always been a balancing act with Food and Wine of, let's say, service-oriented pieces, 10 great wines to for grilling or whatever, and less and more story-oriented pieces. Like, I just did a kind of a lengthy profile piece about Cinzia Merli at Le Macchioli and about her life and about the Bulgari region, and that the balance between those two is part of what makes the magazine interesting to me, I think. I mean, from a writing point of view, I'm more interested in an in-depth story about a vintner who's had a complicated and fascinating life than I am about whether X Cabernet tastes like blackberries or black currants. But you do both, and you have to also be aware of your audience. Our audience doesn't want super geeky wine stories. It's I very little, very rarely talk at length about titratable acidity or anything like that. In fact, I never ever do that in the pages of Food and Wine because all of our readers' eyes would glaze over. So,
do you feel like I guess this is something when we talked with when we had Eric Asimov on too. I feel like since you are talking about food, it gives you kind of this license to talk about like a broader range of wines and varieties because you can kind of frame them in the sense of they're a perfect pairing with this. Have you seen you've been allowed, I guess, more bandwidth to talk outside of maybe some of the varieties, and it's something we can talk about with your book too, than kind of the mainstream wine business.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, sometimes the best wines for food are not necessarily the familiar Cabernets from, big name regions or whatever. And the other thing is that one huge change in the wine business as I've been at Food and Wine and predating when I was at Food and Wine has been this massive explosion of what's available in the U.S. wine-wise. If you talk to people who were buying for restaurants in the mid 90s, in Italy, you had Chianti and Barolo, and maybe from Frascati or something like that. And now you go into an Italian restaurant and you look at the wine list. There are hundreds of wineries you've probably never heard of from every single region in Italy. From Val d'Aosta down to Basilicata and everywhere. And that's true of every wine region in the world is in the U.S. now in some way, in some purchasable way. The weird exception being Canada. It's very hard to get wines from Canada into the U.S., which is odd that you can find a Slovenian wine more easily than a Canadian wine. But that's what are you going to do? But it's so that growth and availability and the interest level that people have in what's out there has necessarily changed what we've written about. Not too long ago, I did a story about Georgian wine, and I went to Georgia, country of, and traveled there and wrote about, Kepi, Amphora wines and skin contact whites and the culture of Georgian wine. And there's not a chance I would have done that story when I first started at Food and Wine because there was no knowledge of it out there to cause you to write it in a sense, and the wines weren't in the U.S. and there's very little known about them. So there's been a big shift in that regard, which is and a really cool one too. It's it's like Ribera Sacra in Spain. Who knew that 20 years ago that there were wines that you could get from Ribera Sacra? You knew Rioja, but that was about it. Maybe 30 years ago, let's say, not 20.
I mean, that's one of the big, probably the big differences between the different paths that you could have gone in your wine career is this one actually afforded you, I'm sure, to travel pretty extensively over the years with Food and Wine. Did any experiences, sort of in other parts of the world, like particularly stand out to you, as opposed to some of the experiences you had here, maybe in Napa or Sonoma when you were coming up?
Yeah, I mean, I've been very fortunate. One, that I've gotten to travel to so much, and also it's convenient that I like to travel. That helps too. For instance, that story about Georgia, that was an extraordinary trip. It was like heading into a completely different world, but sort of somewhere. Felt like I'd moved back in time to some degree. And Georgia is not European, maybe partly European, but partly Asian and partly Middle Eastern and partly kind of Russian East European, and it's this melting pot of all these things, and it was an extraordinary story to research and then a great story to write. There's been others. There's absolutely been others. I mean, sometimes the most interesting trips are not necessarily the most, or they're sometimes a little tangential to wine, though it's a wine story. So, for instance, I went to Christchurch, New Zealand, pretty quickly after the massive earthquake they had there a few years ago, and I was visiting New Zealand wineries in the area, partly because they'd been affected, but also I was talking about the city itself and how it was recovering, because it was kind of a bit of a travel story, and now they sort of opened it up to street art when it had never been allowed before. And so there are all these destroyed buildings covered with murals and things, which was really cool to see. So you sort of see how people respond to a disaster. And that's not technically wine related, but it was actually a wine story. And then there's some things are just, are just memorable because of the people involved. Like Cinzia Machioli, who's had a really fascinating life and has been a blast to write about. There are a lot of great stories. The some of the better stories don't always come out of the most kind of like dramatic trips, but there's a relative correlation, I would say. But those are some. I mean, there's also places that are just stunningly beautiful. Like, the first time I went to New Zealand, I got to the North Island of New Zealand. I was doing a story on the Gimlet Gravels region. I was like, this place is mind-blowingly beautiful. And every single New Zealander there was like, oh yeah, wait till you get to the South Island. I'm like, what the hell's the South Island like? If this is, and I got down to the South Island, and it was like, oh my God, this is even more insanely beautiful. And so, there is that simple pleasure of the fact that when you travel to wine regions, you're largely traveling to places that are pretty attractive.
Was it interesting driving around or tasting through New Zealand and kind of, I guess what's interesting to me there is they're planting a lot more varieties now, but you're able to taste kind of the same grape in different places along your way, and also see how it's grown. Was that kind of cool to go from the North Island and then down to like Canterbury and then over to Central Otago and kind of experience and taste?
It's fascinating because the Pinot Noir specifically from those different regions, is quite a bit different, different expression in each place. And New Zealand's fascinating too, because there's a lot of great wine in New Zealand that's not Sauvignon Blanc, but people forget that because something like some huge percentage of what comes to the U.S. is Sauvignon Blanc, and which isn't to say that New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc isn't good. Some people love it, but there's some stellar Pinot Noirs there. And if you had, some places, outside Wellington, there's some great great Chardonnay from Camus River. I mean, it's up there with good Burgundy. It's a fascinating country and quite varied. And so, but that's that way that some varieties, particularly Riesling or Pinot, or the ones that are super transparent to terroir, express themselves across broad regions as well as like individual vineyards is part of the joy of travel with wine. I think, you head to, you head to Alsace and taste Pinot Gris, and then you head down to, the Veneto and taste Pinot Grigio, and they're from other planets, it seems like.
Oh yeah. Completely agree on that one. Well, I think that's a perfect segue into your book. You want to give us a little overview on kind of what the general concept is, and then I'd love to know how you kind of narrowed down to what you included in it, because I'm sure it was extremely difficult.
It was. So the book's called The World in a Wine Glass, and it came out last November, and people seem to like it, which is gratifying. And it really came out of two things. One was a sense that more and more people were interested in consumers. I mean, not people in the business. Those true people in the business too were interested in kind of, how is this wine made, and more importantly, how are these grapes grown? What am I putting in my body, and two, what is it doing to the earth? And so, this question of like, is it sustainable? Is it organic? Is it biodynamic? Is it regenerative farming? I think that wine trends often follow food trends by quite a few years. Food kind of moves faster than wine in some ways, but there's been for quite a while a lot of interest in like, where did this apple come from? What farm did it come from? How was it grown? Where did this steak come from? Were these cows, grass-fed, free-running cattle, or were they jammed into a feedlot somewhere? And for a long time, you didn't hear much in the context of wine from consumers about those questions. And I've started more and more, particularly with younger wine drinkers, started to just get much more interest in, how is this farmed? Like, how is it made? Why, what is it I'm drinking, as as opposed to just it's a Cabernet from X place. And so that was part of the impetus, and that is also driven by the fact that I think more and more vintners are interested in these questions too, and are working this way. And then the other kind of semi-connected thing was, I was kind of getting sick of the division between natural wine, quote unquote natural wine, and everybody that I admire who's more or less working in a natural or at least fairly low intervention way, but somehow isn't qualified. It doesn't fit into the gang or the group or the category of natural wine. And it seemed to me to be a kind of irritatingly testy, semi-social and political division that didn't need to exist, when the real division for me is between, wines that are made in 200,000 gallon tanks and are, modified and pumped up in whatever way possible, whether it's mega purple or enzymatic additions to fermentations, or, tea bags full of wood chips to give it, oak chips to give it oak character. And that kind of, what I would call, a wine as a beverage product rather than wine as an artisanal, expression of a place. And that's the real division. I mean, that's if you want to split wine into two camps, that's where the actual division is. And so I wanted to write a book, and the working title for the book was Real Wine. My publisher felt that no one would know what I was talking about when I said real wine, except people in the business. And I said, well, okay, because that's how publishers work. And we came up with a different title, which I quite like anyway. I just think, the analogy I make in the book is to Taco Bell tacos. And it's, I actually like Taco Bell tacos, but I'm not delusional enough to think that, whoever's behind the little hatch at Taco Bell has carefully cooked that meat themselves from cattle that were, from a small farm somewhere nearby, and, nixtamalized the corn themselves for the masa to make the tortillas. It just simply doesn't happen when you're making 1 billion tacos a year. And that's a lot of wine. It's, a lot of wine is an industrial product, and it and always has been. There's always been, mass produced, simple wine for, as an accompaniment to a meal, which is fine. But that's not what I'm interested in. And I think that's what that kind of dovetails with that, organic, biodynamic, et cetera thing. Because so many of the wineries that are conscientious about the quality of the wine they're making are also conscientious about the way they're making it, the way they're farming. And so that was the heart of the book. And the book ended up being 60 pages of me explaining why this book exists, and then a whole bunch of profiles of wineries, like 280, from all over the world. I mean, everywhere from Napa Valley to Burgundy to Bordeaux to, the far south of Italy to Lebanon to Georgia to the Biobío and Chile, take your pick. And so it's not short, but it is fun to read because it's all people I've spoken to myself. It's a lot of stuff in their own words. And yeah, I did have to not include some people, or else it would have been a 10,000 page book and no one would ever buy it, and no one could even lift it. But to kind of get back to your original question, I had two kind of filters about, beyond the basic filter, if I didn't include any kind of absentee or corporate owned wineries, I didn't include anyone who wasn't working sustainably, organically, regeneratively, somewhere in that constellation of things. I also mostly didn't include any wines over about $100, $125, because I wanted it to be wines that people could actually afford. So I left out a lot of the kind of great marquee names like Domaine Romanée-Conti, Chateau Reyes, all places that would fit into the context of the book. But when the wine is, when the most affordable wine is $1,000 a bottle, that's a different audience than what I was kind of after. And I think I'd rather write, I'm not sure there need to be many more pages written about DRC at this point. there's been a lot of pages written about DRC, and instead I can write about, the folks at Chanterev, Guillaume and Tomiko, who are making beautiful Burgundies, but they have not had 10,000 pages written about them. So that was kind of how I trimmed down initially, at least the broad things. That is a long answer.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I thought the original title of your book was kind of interesting, Real Wine. Um, I could definitely see that as, if it were published under that name, people who are used to drinking $15, $20, like over cab might be like, oh, well, what do you mean? Like, this is the wine that I like. And it seems like there's a mantra out there of, people say, just drink what you like, just drink what you like. It doesn't matter if, people say it's not the right thing, just drink what you like. But I think that sort of squashes exploration a little bit. I know if you could maybe speak to that a bit, this idea of, sort of identifying something that you're into and sort of staying with it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's true life in general to some degree. I mean, if you decide early on that you really like scrambled eggs and hot dogs and that's it, you definitely are going to have a less adventurous food life than you might otherwise, which isn't to say, it's like one thing I very, very adamantly did not want to do with the book. I did not want to make people feel bad because they happen to like, take your pick, yellowtail or whatever. It's, sometimes wine is just a pleasant alcoholic beverage to have with the meal. And it's again, it's like if I'm mowing the lawn and it's hot and it's Houston where I grew up and, it's middle of August and someone hands me a Coors, I'm going to be fine. I'm going to be just happy as a clam because I have a cold beer in my hand and I don't care if it was made in, in industrial quantities. But I just think that you can, if you're willing to give it kind of a little more, to look a little deeper, you change the way you experience wine and you get something out of it you wouldn't get otherwise. And then the other thing is that it does promote experimentation that way. And I always, I say, learning about wine is not like learning calculus. It's not, it's the pleasure, the learning about wine is pleasurable because you drink wine to learn about wine, and usually in the context of being with other people, which is much more fun for me, at least, than learning calculus was, which I found stressful and not so enjoyable. And so, you get a lot out of that, exploration. You get, you get pleasure out of the exploration process. And I do think that the more it's fine to drink what you like, but there may be things out there you don't know you like, and it's fun to find out what they are. And also it's like literally everybody in the wine business, their tastes change over time too. People, there is the joke within the business that all roads lead to Burgundy, which may or may not be true. But I have plenty of friends that started out drinking X and then now they drink Y, and they, then they go through periods of drinking, this or that and the other thing. And it's one of the joys of wine is there's so much variety out there. It's also one of the things that makes it daunting to the average person who walks into a grocery store. It's like, oh my God, there's 85 different Chardonnays here. What the hell am I supposed to do? But I look at it more as a kind of a freedom than a restriction, I guess. And it's, the book is meant to give you information to play with, in a sense. It's like, it doesn't have to be read linearly. So if you're going to Tuscany, pick it up and read the Tuscan section, and it may tell you about some wineries that you haven't heard of before that sound pretty cool. Or if you're, headed to the store and you want, a wine from Napa, read the Northern California section, and you might end up with the usual Napa Cabernet you get, but you might end up with, something else that's different and interesting. And that's what I hope people get out of it. It was very much written as a book, I hope, that people in the business would like, but more so that people who are not in the wine business would really get into and really like, and it would make them excited about wine rather than daunted by it, which is one of the great problems of wine culture, I guess.
Yeah, we've heard that from like I think it was Joe Fattorini on the wine show in the UK. He's like, we literally tried to make a show that we thought wine people wouldn't like and that the regular public would like, because we were trying to spread the word about wine, and then it turned out that both sides liked it. I really like that, but I would love to get your take on when you're trying to explain to people like a new wine, and you're not trying to just tell them exactly what to taste, because everybody wants you to give them the exact tasting notes. How do you go about explaining it? Because like I attempt structure, sometimes that goes over people's heads. They don't know what acid is. Like, how do you go about it?
Well, it's like if I, Food and Wine has our big event in Aspen every year, and I do seminars there. And if I've got a wine, let's say I've got Larmandier Bernier Champagne in one of my seminars this upcoming June, I'll tell them it's champagne, and I'll pretty quickly lean into who Pierre Larmandier is, what a grower champagne is. Like, in some sense, you can tell them, here's this champagne. It has a citrus note. It has, certain minerality on the end. It's very dry because it's root zero, But I think it actually helps people more to know who made it and something about why they made it the way they made it. Whether they can articulate whether they can put the flavors into words, their palate knows whether they like the taste or not. That's pretty baseline. Whether you can say it's citrus or not, you're like, I like that or I don't like it. And what you don't know is the stuff your palate can't tell you, which is Pierre Larmandier was one of the first growers in Champagne to work organically and biodynamically, and got huge pushback from everybody in his village because they were convinced that by not using chemical sprays, he was going to spread diseases to their vines. He was like anathema. And knowing that and tasting the wine actually changes the way you taste the wine too. I think it gives you some story behind it. And then if I want to go into saying, and it's also super sharp and really linear and very different from what you'd get from like Bollinger or Krug, in that it's got this kind of laser-like acidity. You can do that, but that's within the context of knowing something about the wine as a creation from a person in a place, as opposed to just knowing that it's a bottle of champagne and these are the words that describe it. And it's funny. One of the big discussions right now is about kind of the language of wine and how it can be exclusive. Some, it's like, if you haven't had truffles, then what does it mean to tell you that wine tasted like truffles? And maybe you didn't grow up in a culture that has truffles, which is all fine and good, except that what the problem with that for me is, and I do agree that there's a definite valorization, I guess is the word, of Eurocentric, terms for wine descriptions. But the problem for me is that the least interesting things about wine are often the descriptors used, the adjectives used to describe taste. And so concentrating on that as the problem in the language of wine doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's like, why not just skip the adjectives entirely and talk about, where the wine is from, who made it, why it's the way it is, and why it's significant in the context of the place it's from, and worry less about whether people have had access to gooseberries in their life. Which is all kind of, I don't know. I have a problem with with the way wine is written about, but it's less of a cultural thing than it is just simply about a question about approach in a sense. There's so much more that's interesting besides whether it tastes like blackberries or not. So while I do think also one of the massive changes in wine and one of the best changes in wine has been the growth of diversity within the wine culture, and certainly within the professional wine culture. It's been a gigantic change since when I started. It's really cool to see, people from all realms and, getting into wine, because that's the way wine survives, is by not just being a bunch of, jacket wearing white guys in their 60s, standing around together talking about blackberries. But that diversity is massively important. But I just think that the concentration on what adjectives you use to describe it is kind of bonkers.
Yeah, I completely agree. And then I think also just being more open, like to your point, getting people who might be intimidated by wine, telling them these stories. I've seen that a lot here, and I'd like to get your take on how the quote unquote natural wine movement may be helping this, because I live in Los Angeles, and we're within walking distance of many natural wine bars. Mm-hmm. And when we go there, number one, a lot more of our friends who aren't wine people want to go to these places. And then also whenever they serve wines there, they tend to lead with, this is biodynamic, organic. They talk about how it's made. And then sometimes the only descriptor they give is like, the table will be like, is it funky? And they're like, yeah, it's funky. And they're like, cool. And then like the definition of what funky is so broad, and
it's all over the place.
Exactly. Yeah. But then they're like, but I know how this was made, and it's from this place. And he only has like 2 hectares of this grape I've never heard of. And then they love that story. And I'm like, I've been trying to get you to drink this, like, small wine you've never heard of at my house for a long time. But like, it's so cool because I see people getting open to new places, new varieties that way, rather than the really traditional tasting route, sit down and try these wines.
Well, I mean, natural wine's fascinating, and there are natural wines that I absolutely love, and there are natural wines that I think are messed up, to the point where I find them hard to drink. And there are equally within the conventional wine realm, and I hate conventional because it's a pejorative word in some ways, but within the conventional wine realm, there are wines that are spectacularly good, and there are wines that usually they're not flawed, because the way wine has gone is that actually conventional wines are rarely flawed to the point where you don't want to drink them anymore. But what you get instead is boring. So there are a vast number of really boring conventional wines. Natural wine is rarely boring, but sometimes it's really screwed up. And so I don't think because I like both categories. That's one reason why I was irritated by the wall between them. I think natural wine's fascinating because it's been a really important movement in wine. It's a very, 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 very tiny percentage of the wine that's sold in the U.S. It's super small, and it gets much more attention both from the press and from people in the business than you would think would be justified by the amount of wine we're talking about. But it has done a lot to, well, one, it's cool. Wine has rarely been cool. And natural wine is cool. It, is like the percentage of people with body piercings and tattoos who drink natural wine is much higher than the percentage in conventional wine, let's say. It's there is a social aspect to natural wine that is very unusual in the wine discourse, which is really kind of fascinating. It has been absolutely interesting in terms of how it's kind of broken down the conventions of what you think wine should be. And at the same time, it can be just as pretentious and just as elitist, though a lot of natural wine people would say this isn't true, as conventional wine can be. As anybody who's dealt with, natural wine, there are natural wine snobs just as there are conventional wine snobs, and who will make you feel like you don't get it, And it reminds me very much of the indie music world, particularly in the late 90s, where if you were at all successful, you were a sellout, and as long as you were difficult and weird, you were cool. And it's very much a social world in that way. But it's a corrective to a kind of corporatization and technological approach to making wine that sometimes overshoots, but was necessary too at the same time. Because I think that, wine should be kind of unpredictable. I always liked, Abe Schoner, who was really early on in the natural wine game before it was, I feel like Abe was around before people were really calling it in the U.S. natural wine. But he said, I like to make experimental wines because I like to have some unpredictability about this. And sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes I make experiments that simply don't work out. And that is so not the approach in conventional commercial winemaking. You don't do things that are not going to work out, because then you lose money. And Abe's approach is more intellectual. And I think that that's, part of what's interesting about natural wine. I really dislike the rigidity on both sides of the natural wine wall about sometimes about, from the conventional side, you get like all natural wine sucks. And from the natural wine side, you get all conventional wine sucks. And I think that, but that black and white approach is kind of silly, because there are brilliant wines on both sides of the wall, and there are problematic wines on both sides of the wall. And that's always going to be the case. I don't know if that answered the question, but it's, I obviously have opinions about the whole thing.
No, I think that was really well put. So no, that was great.
Yeah, I did. I mean, I did a lot of thinking about that in the context of the book, and there are natural wines in the book, but there's not like a preponderance of natural wines. But some of the producers who are in there are unquestionably in the natural wine zone, and some are close to it. And it's really more like, who are they and how do they work and why do you care about their wines? And let's worry later whether it has the label natural on it or not.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I know our listeners, who are on the podcast side can't see, but it looks like you have a rack of wines behind you.
I do.
And it looks like several of them are natural too.
Well, actually, what you're looking
Whatever
at
that
in
means.
that particular rack is just a whole bunch of Napa Cabernet. So it's pretty not on the natty side. But if I were to carry the computer over about 40 feet somewhere else, you definitely see a shift in. We did have to organize the room a little just so I could figure out what the hell was in here.
Are you down there? Are you down there freezing in a 55-degree cellar, or what's the setup? And what kind of wines are you drinking?
I'm here freezing in a temperature-controlled wine room that's actually on the 4th floor of the office building where Food and Wine is located. But that is why, on a day that's 85 degrees outside, I'm wearing a fleece.
Yeah.
But it's good for the wine. It was a requirement of the build out of the room that it be temperature controlled.
Nice.
And it's in a lot of stuff, both in all realms. I've instituted a rule, which is basically, if I asked for it, I will definitely taste it. And if I did not ask for it, I will do my best, but I can't always, I can't literally taste every single wine that just appears here.
Mm-hmm.
I would never have any time to write. So it's a bit of a juggling act, but it is a very nice room. And also no one can get into it but me and Lucy, our assistant wine editor. So that helps a lot too. It's a good place to hide.
Just quickly before we wrap up here, what wine are you drinking just like through the week? Is there a region that you're exploring a lot of?
Yeah, so a lot of it fluctuates with my column. So I'm actually working on a kind of a lengthy column for our September issue. We work pretty far in advance. That's a kind of a historical look at California wine. So I've been drinking kind of all over the place in California. I mean, not just region, but stylistically and so on. I lean a lot, especially this time of year, towards zero oak, crisp, aromatic whites, whether that's Riesling from Austria or Germany, Gruner Veltliner, Northern Italian whites, or similar wines from California. That's New York in the summer is hot, and window unit air conditioners don't always work that well. So suddenly, like Amarone seems like maybe not the right idea. But that's a lot of what I've been drinking. I've been drinking. I was drinking a lot of Sauvignon Blanc for a while, which I don't usually do. One, because my wife loathes it, which is fine. Everybody has their opinions, and two, because she loathes it, I just don't drink that much at home. But I was doing a Sauvignon Blanc column, and from all over the world, from everywhere, New Zealand to Loire and a lot of wines that I hadn't tasted before or hadn't tasted in recent memory. And it's nice to kind of rediscover what makes that grape so appealing when it's really good. It's an easy grape to make really annoying wines out of, but you can make gorgeous wines out of it, and so that was fun. And then I'm not sure what next. If I randomly stumble across old beautiful Burgundy that someone left in the hallway, I'll definitely be drinking it, but that doesn't seem to happen that often.
Yeah,
mysteriously, I'm
that'd be a good Monday.
Yeah, more likely to stumble across a bag of trash someone left in the hallway. But, note to the people who live in my building: start leaving out bottles of Burgundy for me.
Awesome, Ray. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. I hope our
absolutely.
listeners can get hold of a copy of your book. Congratulations on it, by the way, and the reception.
Thank you very much. It is, as they say, for sale everywhere that books are sold, which obviously, that can be Jeff Bezos, or that can be, your local indie bookstore. So, but yeah, it's out there in the world, in the wild, which is great.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ray. We hope to stay in touch
Yeah.
and have you on again soon.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
All right, that was our interview with Ray Isle from Food and Wine Magazine. If you're thinking about pairing food and wine, you can obviously read more up on that in Food and Wine Magazine, but you can be the ultimate host with Coravin. You can serve your guests a variety of exceptional wines at home without worrying about wastage. And for now, that is our episode this week. I hope everybody enjoyed, and we'll be back with another episode next week. Cheers.